Hello everyone, maisth here. Welcome to this tutorial on how to rig a breast for a female character in Blender. In this video, we'll cover where to put the bones so the breast can deform nicely, how to make it so that it moves when the shoulders move, as well as adding some control if we need to move the breast in a specific way. Now, adding extra bones to the breast is entirely optional, as most of the time you will use physics so that the breast can be modified in real time. Bone physics usually being a good example of what I'm talking about, in case you don't want to waste too much resources on general physics. But in case you want to have some specific control over how the breast is deformed, then adding some extra bones will help you in that. In case you don't have a model, you can use this one I'm using right now. It's part of my human character tutorial series. I'll leave the link to that series and to the blend file of the model I'm using in the description. Also, if you just want to see how the bones for the breast are made, I'd suggest skipping to section 3 of the video, as that is when we'll be creating everything for that part. Otherwise, keep watching as I'll just be creating the armature for the mesh using Rigify's Armature in this next section. Okay, let's begin. For this case, I will be using Rigify's Armature. This is only to have the basic bones you would have on a humanoid character, but the tutorial is gonna focus on the breast bones. So, I'm gonna be adding the armature. Now I'm gonna position the armature to the shape of the body. I will be deleting bones like the hands and face, as I don't need them for this occasion, and they could mess up the weights a bit, as well as the breastbone, since I will be creating a custom new one. Do note that if you have your own rig, then you don't need to do this, as for this video we'll focus on the breastbones. The rest of the bones in the armature, aside from the spine and shoulder bones, won't be used. So I'm gonna leave a timestamp of when I'm finished adding the armature, so you can skip this part if you want to. Alright, we finished adding the armature. Now let's start adding the breastbones. Now before we start adding the bones, I want to make sure you understand the structure of how we'll be rigging the breast area of this female model. To start with, the breast will be divided into 3 different bone group parts. First, the breastbone, which will be used to deform a general part of the breast, but also having control over the 2 other bones, which we'll be talking about now. Second, the breast tip bone. This bone will be used to deform the tip part of the breast. This is to have more control in this area of the breast. And finally, the third one is the breast singular bones. These will be 6 bones that will be divided in the 12 vertices area of the breast edge loop. These will be used to control specific parts of the breast, so you can have more control over it. For this case, we're not going to be using a mechanism or control specific bones. Instead, all of the constraints and tricks will be applied to the deformed bones, mainly to save some time on doing all of this and to keep it relatively simple, since this is a more long tutorial. But if you want to add constraints to a control or target bone, you can do so. Okay, now we can get on to creating the bones for the breast. And as you can see, I have no bones in the breast area of the armature. That's because I deleted the one Rigify includes, mainly to be on the same page in case you're not using Rigify or have your own armature. So the first thing I'm gonna do is actually select the mesh, go into edit mode, and with face mode activated, I'm gonna select the tip part of the breast. In this case, this face. I'm gonna press Shift S, and I'm gonna click on cursor to select it. This way, we'll have our 3D cursor on this tip part of the breast, so that when we create the breastbone, we'll have it directly on the tip of it. One last thing we're gonna do here is that we're gonna go into transform orientations and click on this plus icon. This will create a new transform orientation on the 3D cursor we have on this face. Now, the reason for this will be apparent in a minute, so bear with me. So select the new face transform orientation, and now in edit mode in the armature, we're gonna be creating a new bone. And as you can see, it was created in the tip of the breast. I'm gonna rename this bone to def breast.l. This bone will be used to control all of the breast on this side. I'm gonna parent it to the spine 0.003 bone, which is this bone right here, in case you have it named differently. Now, one last thing we need to do is to actually change the angle towards this bone is looking. And as you can see, it's looking up. But our breast is looking on a directional position, judging from this face. So remember that thing we did with the transform orientation? What we did with that is that we created a new orientation based on this face. So if I now select the tip part of this bone, press Shift S, and click on selection to cursor, our tip will be in the same position of the origin of the bone. But now if I move the tip on the Z axis, you can see that it's moving along the normal of that face, the tip of it. This is a really cool trick you can do when you need the bone to have a specific orientation of a face normal. Now I'm gonna rotate the bone's row with Ctrl R so the Z axis looks better. Something like this is okay. Now I'm gonna duplicate this bone, change to individual origins on the transformation pivot point and scale it down. I'm gonna change this bone's name to def breast tip.l. This bone will be used to control the tip part of the breast. Parent this bone to the def breast.l bone, like this. Next thing we're gonna do is create the rest of the deformation bones. Now these other bones will be around this area of the breast to control these specific parts as you see here. One thing you must find out before adding the singular breast bones is how many vertices this edge loop has in your breast. If I go to the mesh and select this edge loop, we can see that it has 12 vertices. Now for this case, we're gonna be adding 6 bones for this breast, because that's half of the vertices this edge loop has. So for example, if your character's breast has an edge loop of 16 vertices instead of 12, like mine, then for the bones, you would need to add half of that, which would be 8 bones. This is just so we don't use the 12 bones for the breast, as that would be overkill and the animator would have too many bones to deal with. Anyways, with that said, we can start to add the rest of the bones. So once again, add a bone. It should be in the same position as the last one. I'm gonna move it, and now I'm gonna activate vertex snap, so we can get the bone on the specific vertex point just like this. Now I'm gonna change the name to def breast singular 01.l. Since this will have multiple control points, we're gonna use numbers for our name. Make sure to parent this bone to the spine.003 bone, which will be this bone right here, in case you have it named differently. So now, duplicate this bone and start putting it on the next vertex. So we skip one vertex and put it on the next one, just like this. Keep duplicating, and just like this, we have our 6 bones, which are separated from each other. Now we're gonna make it so they have the same orientation as the breast tip bone. So to do that, we're gonna first select all these singular bones, and then the breast bone, and press Ctrl Alt A. And with this shortcut, they will have the same orientation as the tip, which is very necessary if we want the constraints for our shoulder movement to work well. Now with that done, we can start changing the names of bones we have created. We'll choose delete this number and replace the 01 with 02, 03, and so on. Okay, we have created all the bones necessary for the deformation of the breast. As you can see, we have no mechanism bones to create, and that's because they're not necessary, as we'll be applying the constraints to the deformation bones. Now if you really want to leave the deformation bones as it is and apply the constraints to another bone so you have the deformation bones clean, you can always just create a target bone which will inherit all of the constraints, leaving the deformation bones clean. But for this case, I'm not gonna do it since it's not that necessary for now. Okay, now we're gonna be creating the constraints. They will be separated in 2 parts: the constraints for the def breast bone and the constraints for the def breast singular bones. they will have a somewhat different constraint from each other. So we're gonna start out with the depth breast one. So select the shoulder first in pose mode, then the depth breastbone, and press Ctrl-Shift-C to open up the constraints menu. And then here I'm gonna add two constraints, the copy location one, and lastly the copy rotation one. The copy location is used to copy the location of the shoulder bone so that it follows it when we move the shoulder bone, while the copy rotation one copies its rotation so that it follows it when we rotate it. We do need to modify some values here so that it works properly. In the copy location constraint, make sure to uncheck the y-axis, as well as have the head-tails option set to 1. Also activate the offset option, then change the target and owner options to local space. And finally, make sure the influence is around 0.3. This last one you can modify to suit your own needs, so make sure to test how much you need for your character. Now in the copy rotation constraint, we're gonna uncheck the X and Y axis, change the mix to offset legacy, change the target and owner to local space, and finally change the influence to 0.5. Once again, this last one you can modify to suit your own needs. Alright, with this done, if we move or rotate the shoulder, you can see this bone is also following ever so slightly the shoulder bone, which is just the right thing we wanted. Okay, we're almost there. Now we're gonna focus on the singular bones. For these ones, we only need to add the constraints to one bone. Then we can copy and paste the constraints to the other one. So let's use this bone. So in pose mode, select the shoulder bone, then a singular breastbone, and press Ctrl-Shift-C. And we're gonna add two constraints from the shoulder to this bone, a copy location constraint and a copy rotation constraint. Now I'm gonna select the depth breastbone, not the tip one, but the normal one. And then the singular breastbone, we added the constraints. And I'm gonna add another constraint called copy transforms. So why 3 constraints, and why is one of them coming from the breast and not the shoulder? Well, to explain, the copy location and rotation constraints will be used to follow the shoulder bone ever so slightly, like the breast one we did earlier. But the copy transform constraints is used to follow the breastbone. If you remember, we parented these singular breastbones to this spine bone. So what this constraint will do is that when we are moving the breast from this bone, we want also to follow it ever so slightly. Otherwise, if we didn't have this constraint, it would not be following it, and that would look weird. Anyways, now we can start to modify the constraints values. So the values of the copy location and rotation are very similar to the normal breast constraints. So we'll zoom through this. In the copy location constraint, put the head-tail influence to 1, uncheck the y-axis, activate the offset option, change the target and owner options to local space, and finally put the influence to 0.1. As always, this last one you can modify to suit your own needs. In the copy rotation constraint, uncheck the X and Y axis, change the mix to offset legacy, the target and owner options, put it to local space, and finally the influence, set it to 0.5. You can modify the last one, like the copy location one, to suit your needs. Now, on to the last one, the copy transform constraints. Make sure to change the mix value to before original full, the target and owner options to local space, and finally the influence to 0.5. So in a nutshell, this one will follow this breastbone slightly. It will give it a nice deformation feeling, but as always you can modify the influence to suit your own needs. So now if we move or rotate the shoulder, you can see how the singular bone also follows it slightly. But if we move the breastbone, you can also see how it is following it nicely. So this is a cool effect that you can apply with your constraints so that your bone follows two separate bones with different constraints and influences. Of course, this will be more noticeable when we create the weights. So now to copy and paste this constraint to the other singular bones, we need to select first all of them and finally select the singular bone that has the constraints. Go to Pose, and in here on Constraints, click on the Copy Constraints to selected bones. And voila, we have the same constraints on the other singular breastbones. Pretty cool, huh? And if we move or rotate the shoulder or breast, you can see that they follow along nicely. Another thing I'm gonna do is to create a new layer specifically for the breast. I'm gonna call it breast, So this way they will be all in this layer in case you need to hide them. One last thing we need to do is symmetrize this. So in edit mode, select all the breastbones, right click and click on symmetrize. And if we go to pose mode, you can see they all have the constraints for their respective bones. Okay, we've finished creating the bones and constraints for our breast rig. All we need to do now is create the weights and add some visuals. So let's first create the weights. Okay, now we're gonna be creating the weights. Since this is a basic human mesh, I'm gonna use the automatic weights option. Alright, now I'm gonna check on how the mesh is deforming. It looks decent, but we're gonna check on the breast deformation for now. And as you can see, if we move the breastbone, we can see how we're moving the whole breast, and the other bones are also following nicely along. This is great if we need to control this area and do some animation with it, but now if we move the tip part, you can see that it's also moving part of it, and the singular breastbones as well. So the rigging works, but now we are going to be modifying the weights so it has a better deformation. This part is going to be a bit of a time lapse, but I'll comment on the important tools I use when weighting a bone. So first, let's get into the weight pane. I'm going to select the rig first in object mode, then select the mesh to weight and change to weight pane mode. And now we have the bones along with the mesh selected in weight pane mode. To select a bone in this mode, you just have to hold Alt and click. So I'm going to select the breastbone, and as you can see, there's this amount of weight affecting this area. If we look at the tip or singular bones, there's also a good amount of weight affecting it. So before the time lapse starts, I'm going to be telling you which areas I'll be modifying. The most important ones are the breastbone, the breast tip bone, and finally the singular breastbones, but also the spine and the shoulder bones if necessary. I'm also going to be using symmetry here, so I just have to weight pane the left area only. And finally, the tools I'll be using are obviously the draw option, but also the blur option. This last one is quite helpful to smooth the weights so they don't have an abrupt weight. So this will be a time lapse. I'll still comment when it's needed, but if you want to skip to how the breast deforms with the new weights, then head on to the last section. Alright, the weights are done. I do want to add a minor thing before we see the final result, and that is to add some bone visuals, also called widgets. These are optional, but sometimes very necessary to make sure your rig can be understood by an animator, as they are made to represent what a bone is supposed to do in the animation. Here are some examples of what I'm talking about. Notice how there isn't any of the normal visuals for the bones. Instead, it's all custom made. Now for this case, we'll be needing 3 different widgets. One for the breastbone, the tip bone, and finally the singular bone. So to do this, first I'm gonna go to object mode, and we're gonna be first creating the widget for the breastbone. In this case, it's gonna simply be a square. So let's create a plane, go to edit mode, and in face mode, I'm gonna select the face of the plane and press X and select only faces. So the face is deleted and we're left only with the edges. Okay, now I'm gonna rename this to WGT breast. Now if we head onto the armature, in pose mode, I'm gonna select the breastbone, and now let's go to the bone tab and open up viewport display, and here add it onto the custom object option, the widget that we have created. And there it is. We can see that it's appearing on the bone. It looks a little bit big. So to fix that, I'm gonna modify the scale of the object on the widget itself. So I'm gonna select it, go into edit mode and scale it down. Now the process is the same for the other 2 bones. I'm gonna focus on the breast tip bone for now, and this one will simply be a circle. So let's create a circle. Change the name to WGT breast tip. And in the armature, in pose mode, let's select the tip bone and assign the custom graphic. Okay, there it is. Now I'm gonna scale it down a bit on the circle mesh so it's smaller. And there it is. And now to finally create the singular breastbone widget. This one will be like a wireframe sphere, so I'm gonna create another circle. In edit mode, let's duplicate this one and rotate it again. Let's duplicate this one and rotate it. Duplicate it again and rotate it. And now we have this form that represents a sphere. Now I'm gonna rename this to WGT breast singular. And now in the armature, in pose mode, I'm gonna change the graphic of the singular bones. There's a nice trick to do this to all of them. So select all of the singular bones, then on this option on the viewport display, instead of adding it normally, you must hold Alt while you click on the widget we create, like this. And as you can see, they all have the same graphic. I'm gonna scale it down a bit so the widget is smaller, just like that. Now you will see that the other side is left with no graphics, but there's a simple way to add them to all. We can go into edit mode. We can select all of our breastbones and symmetrize them, just like that. And as you can see, they now have the custom graphics. And don't worry, the constraints will be the same and this won't affect the weights. Okay, there it is. We have a custom graphic for our breastbones. So we have arrived at the final result. And now if we move the breast, you can see that it's deforming quite nicely. If we move the shoulders up, you can see that the breast is following along slowly, and we can even move parts of the breast for a more specific deformation. With this, we have a more complex control of the breast for any situation you should encounter. You can obviously make this more complex by adding more controllers, so you can move more parts, but for this case, I think it's enough for now. So, that's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it, learn how to rig a breast in Blender, and also understand the process behind it. With that said, I'll see you on the next video. Bye bye.